In the following video, we're going to perform a basic geometry modeling exercise, which is going to put everything we learned into context and into practice. So here is what we're going to do. We're going to take this image reference and using polygon primitives and everything we learned up to this point and recreate this environment. Now we're not going to focus on detailing, texturing, or anything that we haven't covered. We're going to simply block in the essence of this environment using basic geometric shapes. This exercise will help you to get familiar with viewport navigation, working with objects, modifying pivot points, duplicating objects, which we haven't covered yet, but we will in this video, as well as working with component mode with each object. Now for game environment modeling, one of the most common things that you will experience is the ability to break down the scene into repeating elements. So in this case, we would not have to model each single piece individually. You can see that there is a lot of repeating columns, walls, pillars, and we would only need to model one and then duplicate that piece of geometry to the rest of the environment. So you will be looking at images and breaking them down into repeating objects a lot. So in this image reference, we only have to model one single column because all of these columns are the same. So we would only model one and then duplicate them across as well as on the other side. Since you would only have to create one and then export and then import into a game engine, and that one column will be duplicated for the rest of your game environment. Same thing for these walls. We would only have to model this one wall and it gets duplicated across. We also have this one pillar and then it repeats down the hallway. Another piece of geometry is right here. It's repeated everywhere in the environment. And then same thing for the ceiling and the floor. So essentially this entire environment is made up of very basic shapes and only 6 pieces of geometry. The floor, column, wall, this indentation piece above the wall, this pillar, and the ceiling. There are a lot of times where you'll have individual pieces to model, but majority of the time you will be modeling objects that are being repeated throughout the environment. Back in Maya, let's go ahead and get started. First, let's go ahead, File, and create a new scene. Now, let's come up to File and save Scene As. This will save our Maya scene into the set project that we created earlier inside Scenes folder. Come down here on the bottom under File Name and name your scene. I'm going to name mine 01-modeling exercise and click Save As. Now before modeling anything inside Maya, you have to establish a human reference scale. This way you can judge proportion and dimensions of your environment to some sort of standard of a character inside your scene. Now this human reference scale and all of the geometry modeled inside Maya will be modeled for a specific game engine and specific game. So the dimensions of your walls, your character, floor, column, and everything else will already be set for you by the game and the game engine. So the dimensions of your environment, the width, height, and depth of each object has to be very specific for your game. To keep this exercise very simple, we're going to keep the units generic. So they're not going to reference any specific game engine or any specific game. But still, we need some sort of reference that we can model to. So let's go ahead and create our human reference scale. This is going to be a simple cube with the dimensions of a character inside the game. So let's go ahead, come up, create a cube, and with it selected, we're going to go into the channel box and set width to 2, depth also to 2, and height set to 6. So in essence, width and depth is 2 feet and height is going to be 6 feet. Now again, I want to make sure to stress this, that these dimensions are generic and we're just setting them so we have something to model to the player inside Maya. But when it comes to a specific game and a specific game engine, you will have these base dimensions given to you and you have to model to them. But in this exercise, we are setting these up ourselves. So with the character base scale dimensions set, this is going to be our character. So anytime you can come up and judge the walls and the rest of the environment to see if everything is correct proportionally. So now let's go ahead and modify our pivot on this base mesh. Going to hit W for the move tool. Now I'm going to press D hold that down, then press C to snap to edges, and middle mouse click to modify the pivot point to set to the bottom of the mesh. And now I'm going to press X, hold that down, middle mouse click, and make sure that our character reference scale is snapping to the grid. Now I'm going to move this out. And now I'm going to place this scale reference onto its own display layer. So select the scale model, create a new layer. With the scale reference selected, right click on the layer and add selected object. Now I'm going to click twice on the third box to set it to reference. This means I won't be able to select it. So this reference scale will help me model everything to correct proportion. Now let's go ahead and turn that off for just a second so we can select it and rename this. So select the scale reference, come up to the channel box, click on the name, and let's name this scale. And let's go ahead and log this again. Now come up to the panel toolbar and enable wireframe unshaded. Now we need to make our grid larger than what it currently is. To do this, let's go to display, grid, and enable grid options. The menu will pop up and we want to increase length and width. So let's bring this up to about 50 and hit apply and close. Now, by looking at the reference, let's begin breaking this down and create each individual piece, and then duplicate those pieces along for the entire structure. Let's go ahead and start with this column first. Let's go ahead and create a cube and go to channel box. Under inputs, let's make this cube height to 10 feet. Since our human reference scale is at 6, 10 may work, but we might need to actually increase it. Let's go ahead and bring this up to 12. And let's set our width and depth to 3. Let's take a look. That looks pretty good. Now let's modify our pivot point and make sure that our column is snapped to the grid. Hold down D and V at the same time, middle mouse click and snap to the vertices on the bottom. Now hold down X, middle mouse click, drag to snap to the grid. So we have our first column. Let's go ahead and rename this. Come up to the channel box, left click on the name and name this column. Now looking at the reference, it has a slight angle. So to do this, we're going to make sure the column is selected, right click and choose vertex. We want to grab these vertices in the front and make sure you left click and hold for marquee selection. Select both of these vertices at the top and then modify the x-axis, the red gizmo, left click and drag to get that angle. Now let's go back to object mode. So we have our column. Now let's create a wall. Let's create another cube. Let's drag this out and let's modify width, height, and depth. For our cube, let's go ahead and create a width at 2. Actually, let's leave it at 1. Our height, I'm going to set it to 12, just like we did for the column. And depth, let's go ahead and set it to 12 as well. Now we need to modify our pivot point and snap to the grid, just like we did for the column. Hold down D and V, middle mouse click, snap to the vertex, hold down X, middle mouse click, and snap to the grid. And let's position it right there, snapped to the grid and to this column. Now let's quickly come up to File, Save Scene, or press Ctrl S, and continue working. Right now, we're gonna need the little small wall indentation that we see right here. For this piece, we're manually going to modify the width, height, and depth. So let's go ahead and create a cube. Let's go to orthographic viewport. Make sure that we are viewing this in wireframe. And let's take this cube and just move it up. First, I'm going to modify the pivot point. Press F to center on the cube. Hold D and I hold V. Snap to the corner of the object, to the vertice. Let's go to top. Hold X. Make sure that it's snapped right along the wall. Right there. Let's go to front view or side view. And I'm going to snap and move this down. Going to right click, go to vertices, and move the vertices up. Now in order to snap vertices to the grid, hold down X and only drag the Y axis, the green axis, moving up. And we'll snap just the vertices to the grid lines. And let's marquee select just the front 4 vertices. And if you're not sure how many vertices you're selecting, when you left click, hold and drag to marquee select, if you come up to the poly count right here in this number, it will tell you how many selected vertices you have. So this way you are absolutely sure that you're selecting 4 and not some additional vertices behind it. Now let's go ahead, left click and drag just to create that indentation. Now I'm gonna left click, hold and drag to select these 4 vertices, and now just drag it out to the sides of the wall. Now we want to make sure that we snap to the edge. I'm gonna hold down X, middle mouse click and drag, or left mouse click and drag, while hold down X to snap to the grid. And it's going to position this wall corner right along the side of the background wall. So now we have our little indentation. So at this point we have 3 pieces created. Let's go ahead, save again, press Ctrl S. And now let's go ahead and create our long floor piece. And then we're also going to duplicate that floor for the ceiling. Again, we're going to create that cube. Let's go ahead and modify the pivot point, just like we did for all the other objects. Hold down D, V, put it right in the corner. Hold down X, snap to the grid, right in the corner here. I'm going to go to side view or front view, and I'm just going to drag this down for the floor piece. And now we can either come up to the channel box and modify width, height, and depth, or we can manually modify it by right-clicking and using component mode. So we can do vertex, we can do edges. Let's go ahead and select the face. I'm going to select just this face. Let's go to front view or side view, and then hold down X, and to make sure that we are snapping to the grid. Or we can just simply freestyle it without snapping. But it's always a good practice to start snapping to the grid. So we're going to just kind of guesstimate the size of the floor right about there. That looks pretty good. And let's do the same thing for this face. If you can't quite see it, we can turn off the grid. Select it, just that one single face. If you're not sure if you selected multiple faces, again, you can come up here, see polygons. We only select a single face. Now let's turn the grid back on and extend it all the way out. Let's go to object mode, and now we can begin duplicating the floor, the column, the wall, and the indentation. But before we do that, we are missing one single piece, and that is the pillar in between the columns. So again, let's come up and create a cube. Let's press F to center our view on that cube. Hold down D and C to modify the pivot. Snap it. Let's go to front or side. Let's zoom in. I'm gonna right click to choose vertices, so we modify these vertices. Make sure 4 are selected, and I'm going to drag them out, snap to the grid so it's aligned. Now for this particular piece, if you take a look, that the pillar is slightly inside these columns. So what I'm going to do is actually select all 4 or all 8. If we go to perspective view, we selected every single vertex. Press R for scale tool, and then we can resize it and rescale it to fit inside this column. This way we know that there's exact same distance on the left and on the right hand side. Let me drag this out a little bit so we see a little bit better. Now I'm going to undo and show you another option. So instead of selecting all 4 vertices, let's go back to object mode. If we scale this object right now with the modified pivot point, it will only scale from the pivot point itself. But what if we want to squeeze and scale this object to have exact same indentation on the left and the right hand side? So we need to modify and center our pivot point on this object. So select the object, this pillar, go to modify, center pivot. Now press R for scale, and now we can scale this in from the center of this object. D and C at the same time, middle mouse click into the corner of this object, hold down X to snap on the grid so it's aligned right to the back of the column. And now in the orthographic viewport, let's right click with the object selected. If you try to right click somewhere around here, sometimes it won't select the vertices of the object selected. It may select the vertices of the nearby object. So it's always better when you have a certain object selected and you can't quite get the selection of the components right, just move your mouse over into an empty area, right click and select vertices. Now let's go ahead and take these vertices and move them, snapping across the entire floor. Make sure that they are aligned to the floor piece. And now we need to give a little bit more depth to this column. So let's come up to side view or front view, whichever one you're in currently, and just drag it out without snaps. And let's go back to object mode. So now we have a little indentation of this pillar that gives a little bit more detail to the object. And now let's go ahead and save. File, save scene. Now that we have all objects created, let's cover how to duplicate geometry. First, let's duplicate the floor piece for the ceiling. So go ahead, select the floor piece. I'm going to hit W to go to Move Tool, and to duplicate, go to Edit and Duplicate. Shortcut key is Control D. So I'm going to press Control D. It duplicated the object. It's going to be right on top of the existing object. I'm going to press X so I snap to the grid and drag it to the ceiling. Now at this stage, it's probably a good idea to start naming your pieces. So let's go ahead and select our floor. I'm going to name this as floor, ceiling, pillar. We have the column. Let's go ahead and name the wall. And let's get this wall detail. So selecting any object and pressing Ctrl D will duplicate that object. In order for us to duplicate this column and this wall across the entire hallway, we can do it manually by using the Ctrl D shortcut. But there is a better way to duplicate your objects with transform. So what this will do is duplicate an object with a specific translate, rotate, and scale option enabled. So if we wanted to duplicate this column across this entire hallway and keep the same distance every time we duplicate, we have to use duplicate with transform. So let's go ahead and select our column. With that selected, let's go to Edit, Duplicate with Transform. Shortcut is Shift D. Now with that column selected and duplicated, you can see that we have column 1. It's going to be positioned right on top of the original column. I'm going to press X and snap to the side of the wall. And as long as I had that object selected, every time I press Shift D from here on out, it's going to duplicate this column with the same distance that was set with the original duplication. So if I keep this selected and I continue to press Shift D, it's going to duplicate that column with the exact same distance. So this duplication is very useful to create geometry that contains a lot of repeating elements. Now only duplicate with transform works. Regular duplication will not do this. So you have to use the shortcut Shift D. So let's do the same thing for this wall. I'm going to select it, press Shift D. This duplicates the wall. Let's go ahead and position it. And with that selected, I'm going to press Shift D again. And it's going to duplicate across the hallway. Now if you do this function, Shift D, let's say we duplicate it again, press Shift D, move this where we want, then you deselect and then you select again, and then press Shift D, it will not work. It duplicated, but it did not translate. So you have to maintain the selection after duplicate with transform. So let's go ahead and delete this one again. I'm going to do it again, Shift D, snap to the grid, and now with that selected, press Shift D again and again. And let's do one last time for this pillar. Now in order to get this pillar duplicated properly, let's go to top view and modify our pivot not to be on the vertex or the edge of this column, but to be on the grid. Because right now if we snap to the grid, we'll lose that indentation. So what we want to do is modify this pivot point to be right in the corner of the grid point. So press D and then X, and then let's snap right to the grid point. Now let's go to side view or front view, and then press D and X to snap right to the top of the column. So essentially the pivot point for this pillar is not on the object itself, but on the grid point. And now let's select the pillar, press Ctrl D, duplicate with transform, press X, move it over. It's going to maintain the same distance and the same indentation as the original one. And with it selected, press Shift D again, and let's press Shift D again and again. Now let's go ahead and finish this up by duplicating all the walls and columns to the other side. Let's select the column, use the Move tool, press Ctrl D to duplicate, and we want to rotate. Hit E for rotation, and in order to get accurate 180 degrees rotation, start rotating in the direction that you want. Notice which direction that it's changing, and let's rotate Y. And let's go ahead and manually type in 180 and press enter. Now let's use Move tool, hold down X and middle mouse click to snap to the grid. Let's do the same thing for the wall. Ctrl D. Let's move it out of the way. Let's snap it to the grid. And let's do the same thing for this wall indentation. Ctrl D. Move it out of the way right in here. And it's getting a little cluttered, so let's press 4 for wireframe. Let's get a little closer, press F. And now we want to rotate 180 degrees. Press E for rotation. Let's start rotating. And at rotate Y, type in 180. And now we want to snap to the grid and align. And if you can't quite see what's going on, let's go to front view and make sure that we are snapping. And looks good here. Let's go to side view, make sure that it's aligned. Right there. Let's press 5 for shaded. And now we want to duplicate the column. So for this, we're going to use Shift D, move it out of the way. Snap into the grid and press Shift D again to duplicate with transform. And let's do the same thing for the wall. Shift D, move it right into space, snap into the grid, and then press Shift D again and again. And last thing to do is just this indentation. We're going to repeat the same functions. Shift D, move it over, snap into the grid, and Shift D again a couple of times. And let's press Ctrl S to save. We are now done with the Model and Geometry Basics exercise. I highly suggest that you follow what we created here and create this environment using all the techniques that you learned so far. So you want to take an image, break that image down into very basic geometric shapes, and then recreate it inside Maya using polygon primitives. Don't do any detailing or anything that we haven't covered yet. Right now you need practice using the interface, using the shelf, using shortcuts, mastering viewport navigation, working with objects, switching to component mode for vertices, edges, and faces, duplicating those objects, and just becoming very familiar in constructing something very simple so everything you've learned so far becomes second nature to you. I recommend that you go through this exercise a few times before moving on to the next video. In the next video, we're going to cover how to delete vertices, how to delete edges, and how to delete faces, which is something that you're going to be using a lot.